Hi, I'm Jet,
Hey, Jen.
a precious child of God celebrating victory over alcohol and self-hatred. This is really low, so by God's grace, I am working through my past to change my habits that are now second nature to me. Habits such as escaping and avoiding painful or emotional issues, seeing myself as always less than or never good enough, and intense feelings of failure due to my own unfair comparisons of myself to others. I grew up surrounded by my family. My most cherished memory was when I was 5 years old. My family, which they were 5, plus my aunt and her 4 children, all lived with my Nana in our quaint 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom house. For those of you like me that can't do math, the ratio is 7 kids to 4 adults. Chaos at its best, but for a 5-year-old, it was sheer awesomeness. Pajama party every night? Yes, please. It'd be much easier to stand here and point blame and say that from the chaotic family dynamics I grew up around is where I got all my issues. Heck, my family did claim the phrase, "We put the fun in dysfunctional." However, working this program and getting closer to God has shown me that it's been my choice all along. I've chosen my reactions. I've chosen to master the art of escaping. My parents had issues, as most did, but they tried their best to continue with the resources they had. Fighting would occur between the two, but luckily I had a brother whom I adored and hoped to someday grow up and be that would assist in my escapism. He was our comedic relief when the fighting would take place. Unfortunately, he had his own issues and secrets, and that would later come out. From that scenario, and because he found a college he liked in Texas, he left. Suddenly, I no longer had my escape to help when the fighting took place. My first real major feelings of abandonment took place then. I went from being Big Bro's little shadow to a very awkward, shy, prepubescent child. Still quite content on playing and being alone. And since I was a military brat, moving every 2 years or so didn't help change that shyness much. I would often escape into my own world through pretend play and later Goosebumps books or various other mysteries. I remember reading Shakespeare by 11. Trying to. My parents thought junior theater might help me bring me out of my shell, as they often would witness me hamming it up on camera or singing along with my favorite musical, Annie. The idea worked in certain aspects. I enjoyed the experiences there and made some very strong friendships. However, I also learned the art of comparison and feeling inadequate. I certainly cannot and will not stand here to say I had a horrible childhood, so please pity me. That is definitely not the case. My mother sacrificed a lot to try and make sure she could stay at home. Being a military wife and a mother of 3 often meant more work than she bargained for. But she did what she could and knew to do. But I'm not here for her story, so I'll continue with my own. From awkward youth comes adolescence, or teens, if you will, and I am quite surprised I can even recall my teen years. My incredibly low self-esteem by the end of my junior high school years was placing my health in jeopardy. I had such an issue with body image that I developed an eating disorder. To this day, I still struggle with having a balanced diet and forcing myself to eat, even though I despise food. Other issues that came up during my teens was an addiction to caffeine and alcohol. I get quite sad when someone brings up an event from my time in high school, and I can barely remember even graduating. When the escape of alcohol was no longer enough for my body and mind, and I felt I couldn't or wouldn't ever get acceptance from my parents or peers, I decided to look for love in others physically. I chose to stay in an abusive relationship throughout high school and beyond because I felt unworthy of true, safe love. That, of course, led to promiscuity, infidelity, an unplanned pregnancy, and a forced engagement. I'd like to say that's it. After that, I found the Lord and came home. But sadly, that was just the beginning. Shortly after the loss of my baby, I picked myself up, moved on, and didn't bother to stop and grieve. Instead, I blamed God, turned away, and started focusing on my schoolwork and college. I could no longer bear to stay in my parents' house. I was disconnected and ready, or so I thought, to move out. I moved out, but only because my parents were assisting me with the rent. Things were going okay, but I decided to enjoy my freedom by living the party and club life. As a result, I was put on probation at work. Apparently, employers don't really like it if you celebrate the weekend early or recover late. Who knew? I later decided to quit. Not having a paycheck to help with my bills and rent, my parents advised me to come back home. I felt like a failure. Throughout all these issues, jokes from my friends would consistently come up. You're a lush. Or drinking games? Nah, you'd win. To which I would reply, I'm not an alcoholic, I'm just thirsty. But in all honesty, there was a problem I didn't want to face. So I checked into a program called CDRP through Kaiser in order to prove everyone else wrong. Boy, was I the wrong one there. I toyed with the idea of alcoholism and managed to remain sober for about a year and 4 months. But one family tragedy occurred. And after all that, bets were off. But one might think it'd be hard to measure a low point throughout my struggles. My mother would have told you it was my miscarriage that was my reason for snapping. My brother would say it was the abusive relationship I chose to stay in. My sister would have said it was my mental health disorder. But it was the loss of my Nana, my hero, that fully broke me. Nana, to me, was the exact image I think of when I heard Women of God. She died at a ripe old age of 95, but was longing to be home with God many years prior. I enjoyed stories told by her, even if I heard them so many times before. And I was amazed that she was faithful, loving, and willing to serve the Lord, even in her last years. After she passed, I felt lost, alone, and scared. I remember the phrase, home is where your heart is. And I felt no matter where I moved to, wherever I lived, she was there at her house waiting. Nana's house, even if I wasn't taking residence, was my home. Because she was my heart. Sorry. I could no longer bear to live in her house even if she wasn't there. And I felt I couldn't go home to my parents either. I became emotionally homeless, and then when my mother offered to allow me to come back to their house, I chose to be physically homeless because of my pride. My parents, noticing my struggles and tired of feeling the abuse from my lies and deceptive behaviors, helped me once again out on my own. On the premise I had landed a dream job, a career, if you will. The rental agreement was signed, keys handed over, and I was home. Of course, it really wasn't that simple. I had quit the dream job before it began, but couldn't bring myself to tell my mother the truth. She was proud of me. I was getting my life together, yet I knew I had failed again. I firmly believe and can attest to the age-old saying, don't lie to your mother, she'll find out eventually, because she really always did. To make up for the mistake, I worked 3 jobs in order to ensure that I could at least pay my own rent. Things were getting better. Work finally narrowed down from 3 part-time jobs to 1 full-time job. Oddly enough, back at the dream job. Of course, the enemy was even more alive in me and my life, and to have things go right would certainly not do it. I found by the end of summer 2008, I was even more broken than I could have ever imagined. My so-called dream job wasn't the dream job I liked, more of a nightmare. And I felt my only way out was to die. I had it set. I planned that when I was on my little cruise vacation, I would slip out through the night and jump off ship. I was serious enough to keep the thought and burden quiet for nearly half a week. In the past, if I ever had a thought or plan was made, I'd often tell on myself in less than a day's time. Apart from the enemy, God was also working just as hard, if not harder, in my life. I finally broke down, knowing it wasn't what I wanted, nor what God intended. The next morning, I went to work as usual, but I had this peace inside me, knowing I'd be okay. The nightmare continued, and I finally realized I was worth more than the treatment I was receiving. When it came time for my lunch, I announced I would be going to lunch, but not returning, ever. Within the same month of walking away from my living nightmare, God called me to answer the tug He placed on my heart. After tons of prayer and invitations from a couple individuals, I decided to finally check out this thing called Celebrate Recovery. I had left that first meeting completely broken and so hungry. It was so much to take in, but I told God prior to attending the meeting that I was only willing to work on my codependency. If you want to make God laugh, then tell him what you are going to do in your life. My decision didn't last long, and before I knew it, I was openly addressing my alcoholism, looking into committing to leadership, and beginning a step study with some amazing women. However, being an escapist by nature, an opportunity arose for me to skip town and have a false sense of starting fresh and anew. As you can plainly see, that didn't last long, and although I returned to California physically in May of 2009, I felt once again a failure and emotionally did not return until nearly a month later. From these struggles, the living nightmares I call my past, God has given me hope and self-love. I no longer plead with God to take me home to be in heaven. Instead, He's shown me the best home ever. I can attend a church that I can call home, literally, because I work here, here at Bethel. I no longer feel I failed myself because I moved back to my parents' house. I see it as a necessity, especially within this area.